On July 31st, 1989, the Nintendo Game Boy was released in North America. When it first came out, it got a lot of mixed reviews from critics saying that the Nintendo Game Boy had inferior hardware compared to other handhelds like the Sega's Game Gear or Atari's Lynx. Despite the mixed reviews, the Game Boy was successful, selling over 1 million units within a couple of weeks in the United States. Part of the reason why it was so successful was from the launch title games like Super Mario Land and Tetris. Also, the battery life was superior compared to the other handhelds at the time. Nintendo Game Boy was absolutely dominating in the early 90s, but there was one company that decided to challenge the Game Boy in 1992. Enter Watara, a Taiwanese company that was willing to take on the Game Boy. In 1992, Watara released the gaming handheld Supervision, also known as Quickshot Supervision in the UK. The Watara Supervision was trying to be everything better than the Game Boy. The price point was lower than the Game Boy, the games were also very cheap. An interesting unique feature that the Supervision had to offer was linking the handheld to your TV so you can play your handheld games onto the big screen. Games played in this way would display in 4 colors. This feature appeared 2 years earlier compared to Super Game Boy. So far, the Supervision is looking pretty good, but what exactly caused the downfall of this handheld and why it couldn't surpass the Game Boy? Here's some major advantages that the Supervision had compared to the Game Boy. For about $50, the Supervision came with crisp ball, 4 AA batteries, and a set of headphones. The Supervision had a slightly larger screen than the Game Boy. The Supervision has the same audio channels as the Game Boy, but also includes an extra channel for audio DMA output. Multiplayer is handled via a DP9 port built into the unit, so the Supervision doesn't require purchasing a special multiplayer cable. The unit is easy to take apart. This is important if you want to repair the device with little to no effort. The Game Boy AC adapter will work on the Supervision. The most well-known model of the Supervision had a bendable midsection to allow the player to adjust the screen's position, kinda similar to the Game Boy SP. Here are some of the major disadvantages of the Supervision. The durability doesn't last long at all. The Supervision can get easily damaged over the years and no longer work. The D-pad wasn't as good as the Game Boy. The Supervision is bigger and heavier than the Game Boy, which makes it slightly harder to put in your pocket while traveling somewhere. Only 65 games were released, and a lot of the games were clones from other famous games and were considered to be lesser quality compared to the Game Boy. Let's look at some of the games. We got Super Kong. This game is very similar to Game & Watch version of Donkey Kong 3. Another popular game on the Supervision was Crisp Ball, which is from another popular game called Breakout. Another issue with the Supervision is a lot of the game covers just look extremely weird. I mean, would you want to play a game that has a cover like this? Even though the handheld garnered some attention at launch, it was ultimately unsuccessful in unseating the Game Boy from its position as the world's most popular handheld. Reasons commonly cited are the poor quality screen, which was known to blur and made following the action difficult while playing, a general lack of games, and the simplistic nature of those that were released. Yet, another problem was that most of the games that were available were developed in Taiwan or Hong Kong, meaning that fans of big-name Western and Japanese developers were underwhelmed by the apparent lack of support from these companies. Only a tiny handful of games were developed by third parties, including Sachin and the British developer BITS, up against Nintendo's list of popular franchises like Zelda, Mario, and Metroid, and those of its third parties like Castlevania and Mega Man, all of which eventually surfaced on the Game Boy. The Supervision games were of little interest to most. More third-party games were planned to be released like Rambo and Terminator in 1993, but the Supervision was discontinued in less than a year. In the end, most people saw the Supervision as just some cheap knockoff version of the Game Boy, but the Supervision did try to put in effort to challenge the Game Boy and stir up the competition 30 years ago. It made a good attempt, but it wasn't enough. Thanks for watching.